The Second Voyage of Sinbad. I designed, after my first voyage, to spend the rest of my days at Baghdad, but ere long I grew weary of a quiet life. Accordingly I purchased rich commodities, and went to sea a second time, with some other merchants. One day we landed on an uninhabited island, almost covered with trees bearing delicious fruits. While some diverted themselves with gathering flowers, and others with gathering fruits, I took my wine and provisions, and sat down by a stream, between two large trees, which formed an agreeable shade. After I had eaten of my provisions I fell asleep. I cannot tell how long I had slept, but when I awoke, not only my companions, but the ship itself was gone. Nothing could exceed my grief and consternation at this event. I shrieked with agony, and threw myself upon the ground, where I lay some time in the deepest affliction, and bitterly upbraiding my folly in not having been content to remain in peace and security at home. After a long interval I became more resigned to my misfortune. I climbed to the top of a very high tree, to see if there were anything that could give me hopes. When I looked towards the sea I beheld nothing but sky and water, but looking toward the island, I perceived something large and white, but the distance was too great to allow me to distinguish what it really was. I therefore hastened down from the tree, and taking up my provisions, I ran towards it. As I came nearer, I thought it was a large white bowl, and when I came quite up to it, and touched it, I found it as smooth as ivory. I walked round it, to see if it was open on any side, but it was not, and it was impossible to climb to the top of it, the surface was so smooth and slippery. It was at least 50 paces round. By this time it was near sunset, and on a sudden the sky became quite darkened. I looked up to see what had occasioned this sudden darkness, and beheld a bird of enormous size moving like a great black cloud towards me. I immediately recollected that I had heard mariners speak of a bird called a roc, so large that it could carry away young elephants, and I concluded that the great white bull which I so much admired, must be its egg. I was right in my supposition, for the bird alighted, and sat over the egg. As I perceived her coming I had crept close to the egg for shelter, so that I had before me one of the legs of the bird, which was as large as the trunk of a tree. I tied myself firmly to the leg of the roc with the cloth of my turban, in hopes that when she flew away the next morning she would carry me out of this desert island, and having passed the night in this condition, the bird flew away the next morning, and carried me so high into the air that I could not see the earth, and suddenly descended so swift, that I lost my senses. On coming to myself, and finding the roc on the ground, I speedily untied the cloth which bound me to her leg, and scarcely was I free, when the bird, having taken up a large serpent in her bill, again flew away. The place in which the roc left me was a deep valley, encompassed on every side with high mountains, whose lofty tops seemed to reach the clouds. Their sides were so steep that it was impossible to ascend them. This was a new perplexity, so that when I compared this valley with the desert island from whence the roc had brought me, I found I had gained nothing by the exchange. As I paced up and down the valley, musing on my hard fortune, I observed that the ground was strewed with diamonds of surprising large size. I took great pleasure in looking at them, but I saw such objects as I could not behold without terror and dismay. These were serpents peeping out of the holes in the rocks. I got as far from them as I could, and spent the day in considering how I should escape from this scene of splendor and horror. And when night came I took shelter in a cave, the entrance of which I covered with large stones to preserve me from the snakes, but their hissing was so incessant during the whole night, that I could not close my eyes. When day appeared the serpents retired to their holes, and I came out of the cave trembling. I walked a long time upon diamonds without the least inclination to touch one of them. At last I sat down, and being overcome with fatigue I fell asleep. I was awakened by the noise of something that fell close beside me. This was a great piece of fresh meat, and immediately I saw several others fall from the rocks in different places. It immediately occurred to my mind the account I had heard of the famous Diamond Valley, and the stratagems used to get jewels from thence. But now I was convinced what I heard was true, that the merchants came to the top of these impassable mountains, near where the eagles build their nests, and throwing joints of raw meat down into the valley, the diamonds upon which they fall stick to them. Then the eagles, lured by the smell of the meat, pounce with great fury upon it, and carry it to their nests to feed their young, when the merchants, being on the watch, frighten away the eagles, and take the diamonds. The falling of the meat into the valley gave me hopes of getting alive out of this dreadful abyss, which otherwise must have been my grave. I therefore hastened to pick up some of the largest diamonds I could find, which I carefully put into a little bag, and fastened it to my girdle. I then selected the largest piece of meat in the valley, which I tied to my waist with the cloth of my turban, and then lay down upon my face to wait the descent of the eagles. They were not long in coming, and one of the strongest, having pounced upon the meat upon my back, flew with me to its nest on the top of the mountain. The merchants began shouting to frighten the eagles, and when they had obliged them to quit their prey, one of them came to the nest where I was. At first he was much frightened at seeing me, but recovering himself, began to quarrel with me, and accused me of stealing his goods. "You will treat me," replied I, "with more civility when you know me better. Do not be uneasy, I have diamonds enough for you and myself too, far more than all the other merchants put together." I had scarce done speaking when the merchants gathered round us. I told them my story, and they were equally surprised at my expedient to save myself and my courage to attempt it. Having carried me to the place where they sheltered themselves, I opened the bag, and they declared that in all the courts they had been they had never seen any diamonds of equal size and luster. I desired the merchant, to whose nest I had been carried, to take as many as he pleased, but he contented himself with taking one of the least, declaring it was of sufficient value to make his fortune. I spent the night with the merchants, to whom I related my history a second time. I could not moderate the joy I felt in having escaped so imminent a clangor. Indeed, at times it appeared to me as if I were dreaming, and I often started, and questioned myself if I were in reality safely out of the inaccessible valley. The merchants having gathered together their diamonds, we left the place on the following morning, and crossed the mountains till we arrived at a port where we took shipping, and landed on the Isle of Roa, where the trees grow that yield camphor. Here I exchanged some of my diamonds for other merchandise, and from thence we set sail for Balsora, and continued my journey overland to Baghdad, and once more arrived in my native city. I gave great alms to the poor, and lived there for some time. Thus Sinbad ended the history of his second voyage, presented Hindbad with another purse, and desired him to return on the following day, which the porter did not fail to do, and dinner being ended, the master of the feast resumed his narration. Goodbye, my friends.